She caught the attention of a biker gang that the whole town considered heroes. They humiliated her and thought she would be left alone, but they didn't know who would come for her that night. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The town seemed at first glance like the sort of place where time had chosen to slow its pace and let the years drift by without consequence. Old wooden houses leaned gently along the main street, their porches decorated with hanging baskets of flowers in the spring and flags during holidays. The diner still served pie with the same recipe from decades ago. The church bells rang faithfully on Sunday mornings, and children biked down the dusty lanes without much thought of danger. It was the sort of town that outsiders often described as wholesome, the kind of place that appeared on postcards with the caption, "Welcome to a community with heart." And at the center of that carefully polished image stood the motorcycle club that called itself the Iron Eagles. To the casual eye, the Iron Eagles were the town's pride. Their gleaming bikes roared in formation down Main Street during parades, their leather vests embroidered with a proud eagle spreading its wings. They were men who fixed potholes on rural roads, who carried food baskets to widows during the holidays, who organized charity rides that raised thousands for the local hospital. Photographs of their leader, Roy Harper, often appeared in the local newspaper, his wide smile and strong handshake portrayed as symbols of strength and solidarity. If there was a storm, they were the ones hauling fallen branches from driveways. If there was a fair, they parked their bikes nearby and handed out tickets to kids who couldn't afford rides. To the people who only looked at the surface, they seemed like the kind of rough-edged angels every small town dreams of having. But beneath that polished veneer lived another story, one that most of the town suspected yet refused to name out loud. The Iron Eagles carried themselves with a power that was not granted by good deeds, but by fear. Their charity events were real enough, but the money they raised bought them silence from local officials who knew better than to ask how much of it reached the hospital. Their work repairing roads always happened after a fight the night before, a quiet way of erasing evidence. Their smiles in the newspaper never reached their eyes, which glinted with arrogance and control. They were the sons of the soil, they said, and that soil was theirs to decide who could stand upon it. Roy Harper embodied the duality perfectly. In public, he was a figure of charm, a man with a booming laugh, a father of two grown sons who wore crisp shirts when attending church with his wife. He knew everyone by name and slapped backs with the familiarity of kin. But within the circle of his riders, once the town's gaze had shifted elsewhere, his voice hardened and his face settled into something colder. He spat out words about outsiders, about who belonged and who did not, about how the town's traditions were sacred and needed to be defended from the contamination of change. His men listened with nodding heads, emboldened by his leadership. They rode not only to display their machines, but to patrol an invisible border, ensuring that those who were different were reminded of their place. Most people in town pretended not to see that side. They were used to silence, used to the weight of unspoken truths pressing on their throats. The sheriff's office looked the other way when complaints were filed about fights in bars or broken windows. Business owners knew better than to ask questions when a biker lingered too long near their shop front. A subtle reminder of protection that came at a price. Parents told their children to wave politely and move on. Everyone knew the balance better to let the Eagles be the heroes they pretended to be than to provoke the storm hiding behind the chrome and leather. Into this town came Alicia Rivers. She was 30 years old, tall and poised, with dark skin that seemed to carry light within it. She was not a woman who tried to draw attention to herself. Her hair was usually pulled back in a simple knot. Her clothes were practical, her voice calm and measured. She had moved here only a year earlier with her husband Daniel, hoping for the quiet stability of small-town life after years of his deployments abroad. Alicia had taken a position at the local elementary school, where she taught reading and history. The children loved her patience, the way she crouched beside their desks to help them trace letters or sound out difficult words. Parents, at least to her face, spoke politely enough, though their eyes often slid over her as though she were only half seen, a presence they tolerated rather than welcome. Alicia was not naive. She had grown up in places where the air held the weight of prejudice. She had recognized the faint tightening of smiles when she entered the grocery store, the way conversations sometimes paused as she passed by. The children warned quietly not to ask too many questions about their teacher's life, but she had chosen to believe in patience, in the value of steady work and quiet dignity. She had Daniel by her side, and that was enough. Still, unease had begun to gnaw at her edges. She had noticed more than once the way the Iron Eagles lingered when she walked home from the store. Their bikes rumbled slower when they passed her on the street, their eyes tracing her with a boldness that was meant to unsettle. She had seen Roy Harper himself once, his broad shoulders framed in the doorway of the bar as she crossed the road. His smile had been thin, not the cheerful grin that appeared in the newspaper, but something that carried a warning, as if to say, "You do not belong here." She had walked on, lifting her chin, not granting him the satisfaction of hesitation. Neighbors noticed these things too, but their silence was louder than any words. One evening, as Alicia returned from the market with her arms full of groceries, she caught the eye of Mrs. Dawson, the elderly widow who lived 2 doors down. The woman's face tightened as the distant growl of motorcycles filled the air, and she quickly stepped inside, closing her curtains. Alicia had smiled faintly to herself, understanding more in that moment than in all the polite exchanges of the past year. In this town, danger was not confronted, it was endured in silence. Daniel had warned her when they first arrived. He had told her that the calm of small towns could be deceptive, that people often clung to illusions of harmony while bearing the ugliness that lurked underneath. "You'll see it in their eyes," he had said quietly once, his hand warm over hers. "They'll smile at you, but the truth is always waiting underneath." Alicia had nodded but chosen not to dwell on it. She wanted to believe in the peace she had sought, but on that late afternoon, with the sun sinking low and the road stretching empty ahead, she felt the truth settle more heavily. A group of riders passed her slowly, their engines low, their helmets gleaming. One of them, a tall man with a jagged scar across his jaw, tilted his head as he looked at her. His mouth twisted into a grin that was not playful, not curious, but predatory. The moment was brief, but it sank into her chest like a stone. She tightened her grip on the grocery bags and kept walking, her back straight, her steps measured. She would not give them fear. Yet the air around her seemed to thicken with menace. Every sound of an engine carried weight. Every glance from a stranger reminded her that she was an outsider in a place that did not forgive difference. The facade of the Iron Eagles as noblemen on shining machines was cracking, at least for her. And though she told herself to breathe, to focus on the rhythm of her steps, she knew deep inside that the mask of virtue worn by the bikers was only that, a mask. The first chapter of her story in this town was closing, and a darker one waited to unfold. The evening fell slowly over the town, dragging with it a heaviness that clung to the air like the remnants of a storm. Alicia walked along the road leading from the small grocery store toward her home, her arms burdened with bags filled with bread, vegetables, and milk. The day had been ordinary, filled with the chatter of children in the classroom, the routine corrections of homework, the usual small smiles she gave to colleagues in the teacher's lounge. It should have ended quietly, as so many other evenings did. Yet there was an unsettled rhythm in the air, a tension that she had begun to sense more and more with each passing day. She had noticed the way the town's friendliness faltered when the Iron Eagles were near, how people crossed the street to avoid their path, how the smiles turned thin and brittle. She had seen them ride past her before, slowing their machines, their eyes on her with the weight of an unspoken warning. Tonight, as she walked the lonely stretch of road, she knew they would not simply pass. The first sound was a low growl, the rumble of engines drifting across the distance. It was not unusual to hear motorcycles in this town, but something in the rhythm of this sound was deliberate, like the tightening of a noose. The roar grew closer, multiplied, until the darkening horizon trembled with its weight. Alicia's steps quickened, though she fought to keep her posture steady, refusing to appear afraid. The grocery bags tugged at her arms, heavy, awkward, and she gripped them tighter as though that simple act could anchor her in place. The road was empty, but for her, the fields on either side stretching vast and silent, the sky painted with streaks of orange and gray. When the first headlight appeared behind her, she knew it was not chance. 4 motorcycles emerged from the dusk, their lights glaring like eyes, their engines snarling with menace. They rode in formation, surrounding her without touching, circling like predators testing their prey. The bag slipped from her arms, tumbling to the ground, spilling apples and a loaf of bread onto the dirt. One of the riders laughed, the sound sharp and ugly against the night. She turned, trying to step away, but a hand shot out, rough fingers gripping her wrist with cruel certainty. Another rider dismounted, his boots crunching against gravel, his shadow tall under the glow of the bike's light. They did not speak at first. They did not need to. Their presence was enough, their laughter filling the silence with something jagged. One of them shoved her toward the group, and she stumbled, catching herself only to be grabbed again. Her protest was cut short by the force of their movements. They dragged her to a waiting van, one of their tools for errands best left unseen, and pushed her inside. The door slammed shut, plunging her into a cage of metal and darkness. The engine roared again, and the world outside slipped away, replaced by the jolting rhythm of wheels over broken road. The ride felt endless, each turn and bump eroding the fragile calm she tried to hold. She thought of Daniel, of his quiet warnings, of the way he had always seemed able to sense danger before it revealed itself. She had brushed his concerns aside, believing that dignity and patience could shield her. But now, bound by strangers who saw her only as a target, she understood his caution. Her chest rose and fell quickly, but she willed her face to stillness, remembering his words. Fear feeds them. When the van finally stopped, the door was wrenched open, and the blinding white of headlights poured inside. The bikers dragged her out, their hands rough, their voices harsh with laughter. They had brought her to a forgotten corner of the town's industrial district, where the skeleton of an old warehouse stood against the night sky. Rusted beams jutted upward like broken ribs, and weeds curled through cracks in the concrete. It was a place where no one would come, where silence reigned except for the echo of their boots and the hiss of their laughter. They pulled her to a tall metal post that stood beside the warehouse, its surface cold against her back, its height looming. Thick ropes coiled in their hands, and before she could gather the breath to speak, they wound them around her wrists, yanking until the fibers cut into her skin. She winced as the coarse strands scraped flesh, the pain sharp and biting, but she refused to cry out. The more she resisted with silence, the louder their mockery grew. They bound her arms tight, pressing her back against the post, her breath shallow as the ropes tightened around her chest. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, leaned close, his breath foul with the stench of beer. He laughed in her face, calling her words meant to cut, telling her she did not belong in their town, that she was a stain on their streets. The others chimed in, their insults overlapping, building into a chorus of cruelty. Another pulled out his phone, raising it with the intention of filming, capturing her humiliation for their amusement. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, his grin twisted with delight. Alicia closed her eyes for a moment, pulling strength from deep within. She remembered Daniel's voice, calm and steady, telling her once that silence was a weapon, that in a fight the loudest man was often the weakest. She lifted her chin, steadying her breath, letting the ropes bite into her skin as she stood straighter. When they called her name, she did not answer. When they laughed, she did not flinch. Her silence infuriated them, turning their amusement into a desperate need to provoke reaction. They circled her, pushing her shoulder, spitting into the dirt near her feet, threatening with gestures that were half performance, half genuine menace. The leader of the group, Roy Harper himself, stepped forward finally. He was larger than the others, his beard thick, his presence commanding in a way that explained why the town believed in him. Yet up close, stripped of his public mask, there was no heroism in him, only cruelty and the intoxication of power. He spoke with authority, declaring her a lesson, claiming that what they were doing was justice, that the town must be protected from people like her. His men cheered at his words, feeding on his approval. As he spoke, the ropes cut deeper into her wrists, the ache spreading through her arms. Blood trickled at the corner of her mouth from where one of them had struck her earlier, the metallic taste mixing with the dryness of her throat. She felt the sting, the exhaustion pressing against her. but she refused to collapse. She locked her gaze on the horizon beyond the circle of headlights, where the night met the fields. She imagined Daniel out there, imagined his steady stride, the calm in his eyes. She held to that image as though it were armor. The men grew bolder, one shouting that they should leave her there for the night, another suggesting worse. Their laughter rose again, wild and unrestrained, echoing across the empty lot. The glow of the phone remained fixed on her, capturing every bruise, every drop of blood, every moment of her silence. They wanted the world to see their cruelty as triumph, their hatred as power. But beneath their bravado was something fragile. She noticed it in the way one of them glanced toward the road, uneasy at the thought of headlights approaching. She saw it in the way Roy's hand twitched slightly as he tugged the rope tighter, as though beneath his arrogance lived the seed of fear. They thrived on control, on the belief that no one would challenge them, that the town would continue to look away. Yet Alicia knew something they did not. She knew Daniel was near, that his instincts would bring him to her, that he would not let silence bury her. The night pressed heavy, the air thick with exhaust fumes and cruelty. The ropes dug deeper, and her body trembled with exhaustion, but her mind remained sharp. She whispered a prayer beneath her breath, not in desperation, but in defiance, a promise to herself that she would endure, that this night would not end as they imagined. The bikers reveled in their game, confident in their invincibility, blind to the storm already gathering at the edge of the darkness. What had begun as another ordinary evening was unraveling into something far more dangerous, a moment where masks fell away, where the truth of men who pretended to be saviors was revealed in their laughter as they tied an innocent woman to a post. And though Alicia stood bound and bruised, she carried within her the quiet certainty that their power was a lie, one that would soon be shattered. The horizon lay silent beyond them, but in that silence waited change. The night had grown heavier, the air thick with the sound of engines and the cruel laughter of men who believed themselves untouchable. Alicia remained bound to the post, her body aching, the ropes cutting deeper into her wrists each time she shifted her weight. Her face stung from the blows, her mouth tasted of iron, but her spirit had not broken. She lifted her gaze above the harsh glow of headlights, beyond the circling shadows, toward the stretch of road that vanished into the darkness. Somewhere out there, she believed, Daniel was moving. He would not stop until he found her. She remembered the steadiness in his eyes, the way he carried silence as a shield. The bikers did not know him, but soon they would. Daniel Rivers had been restless long before the first whisper reached him. He had learned long ago to trust the unease that stirred in his chest, the subtle shift in the air that warned him when something was wrong. After years of service in faraway lands, after nights where danger crept closer than breath, his instincts had sharpened into something nearly unshakable. That evening, when he had returned to their small home and found Alicia absent longer than she should have been, the feeling came swiftly. He dialed her phone again and again, listening to the hollow ring that ended without an answer. He stepped outside, his eyes scanning the quiet street, his jaw tightening as the silence pressed back at him. The first clue came in the form of spilled groceries, a half-crushed loaf of bread, apples scattered in the dirt, a carton of milk split open and seeping into the dust. Daniel knelt, his broad hand brushing against the bruised apple skins, his chest tightening with certainty. Something had happened here, and it had happened quickly. He rose slowly, his eyes lifting to the horizon where faint tire tracks curved away from the road. His body moved before thought caught up, his steps carrying him toward his truck with the weight of inevitability. When he turned the key and the engine growled to life, it was not the sound of panic, but of calm resolve. Daniel had been here before, in deserts and jungles, in places where chaos waited in the shadows. The only difference now was that the battlefront had moved to his own home, and the woman he loved was the one in danger. His hands gripped the wheel, his gaze fixed ahead, and he followed the trail left behind by engines that believed they were untouchable. The industrial district loomed in the distance, its rusting skeletons rising against the horizon. Daniel slowed as he approached, the glow of headlights spilling into the night. He cut his own engine, letting the silence return, and stepped out onto the gravel with deliberate calm. His boots crunched softly against the earth as he walked, each step measured, each movement carrying the gravity of a man who had seen violence and survived it. The bikers noticed him almost at once. Their laughter faltered, the circle of jeering faces turning toward the figure that emerged from the shadows. Daniel was not dressed for war, only in jeans and a simple jacket, his broad frame silhouetted against the night sky. Yet there was something in his presence, something carved into the lines of his face and the stillness of his movements that unsettled them. He did not rush, did not shout. He walked forward as though the outcome of this night had already been written. Alicia saw him first with the clarity of relief, her breath catching as his form drew closer. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, her body trembling from exhaustion. But her spirit surged at the sight of him. For the first time that night, her heart beat not with fear, but with certainty. She whispered his name beneath her breath, a sound that vanished in the wind but carried enough strength to steady her. The bikers, emboldened by numbers, tried to mask their unease with mockery. Their voices rose again, tossing jeers into the night, boasting about the power of their brotherhood, about the law of their leader. Roy Harper himself stepped forward, his beard bristling, his chest swelling with arrogance. He called out to Daniel, his voice heavy with the confidence of a man who believed the town belonged to him. His men laughed, circling tighter, their boots crunching against the gravel, their eyes bright with anticipation of violence. But Daniel did not answer. He stopped only a few paces from the circle, his gaze sweeping across the bruises on Alicia's face, the ropes biting into her skin, the tears she held back with quiet dignity. His jaw tightened, his fists curling at his sides, but his voice, when it came, was low and steady. He spoke not as a man desperate, but as a man certain of his strength, and in that certainty there was more menace than any shouted threat could carry. The silence that followed weighed heavily. The men shifted, their laughter breaking into uneven notes. The first to step forward was one of the younger bikers, his movements sloppy, fueled more by bravado than skill. He swung wild, his fist cutting through the air toward Daniel's face. But Daniel moved with the precision of years spent in combat. He sidestepped with ease, his hands snapping forward to seize the attacker's wrist, twisting it until the man cried out and fell to the ground. The sound of bones straining filled the air, and the first biker collapsed, clutching his arm in defeat. The others hesitated, but hesitation was a weakness they could not admit to. Another lunged, his fist aimed with more force, his weight driving forward. Daniel blocked with his forearm, absorbing the strike, then pivoted with the grace of training that had become instinct. His elbow crashed downward, and the man howled, stumbling back, his arm rendered useless by the single calculated blow. The circle broke, the arrogance faltering. A third tried from behind, rushing forward in desperation. But Daniel was already turning, his body flowing with the movement. He seized the man by the collar of his jacket, lifted with brutal force, and hurled him into the dirt. The biker's face struck the ground with a dull crack, his breath knocked from his lungs. 3 were down, the silence of the night broken only by their groans. Roy Harper stared, his confidence shaken, the mask of superiority cracking around the edges. He stepped forward, his hand trembling as it reached into his pocket, pulling free the glint of a knife. He flicked it open, the blade catching the light of the headlights. His voice rose in defiance, spitting words about ownership, about the power of his family, about the law being his to command. But the words felt hollow now, his authority bleeding away as quickly as the courage of his men. Daniel's eyes never left him. He stepped closer, slow and unshaken, his shadow falling across Roy's face. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried the weight of storms. He named who he was, the years of service, the brothers he had carried out of fire, the battles he had fought. He reminded Roy of the difference between a man who lived in shadows of cruelty and a man who had faced true darkness and survived it. Each word stripped away the illusion of Roy's strength, leaving only fear trembling in his hands. Roy lunged, the knife flashing in desperation, but Daniel's hand shot up, seizing his wrist with unbreakable force. The blade slipped, clattering to the ground, and Roy fell to his knees, his face twisted with pain and humiliation. Daniel did not strike him. He did not need to. His silence, his steady gaze was punishment enough. Alicia felt her breath catch as she watched. Her body still ached, her skin raw, but her spirit surged with a fierce pride. She had endured their mockery, their cruelty, their attempt to reduce her to nothing, and now she saw justice rise before her. Her whispered prayer had been answered not by chance, but by the certainty of the man who had promised to protect her. Daniel turned at last, his hands moving quickly to untie the ropes. His touch was gentle, easing the coarse fibers from her bruised wrists. When the final knot fell, she collapsed into his arms, her strength finally giving way. He caught her, steady and sure, his arms wrapping around her as though nothing could ever reach her again. For a brief moment, the world was quiet, and it was only them, alive together, unbroken. But the night was not finished. In the distance, the shrill sound of tires screeched against gravel, a new engine roaring toward them. A pair of flashing lights cut through the dark, painting the scene in red and blue. The sheriff's cruiser barreled down the road, sirens off but menace alive in the flashing beams. The man inside was no stranger. It was Sheriff Harper, Roy's father, the figure who had long allowed his sons and their men to act as they pleased. As the cruiser skidded to a halt, doors flew open, and the sheriff stepped out, his uniform stretched over his heavy frame, his badge gleaming in the artificial light. His eyes swept over the scene, the groaning men in the dirt, his son on his knees, Daniel standing tall beside his battered wife. His face darkened with rage and disbelief. The fragile calm that had followed Daniel's arrival fractured. The fight for survival had ended, but the fight for justice was only beginning. The flashing lights washed over the broken scene, red and blue streaks cutting through the night, painting the dirt in the faces of the beaten bikers in harsh, pulsing color. Sheriff Harper stepped out of his cruiser with a heaviness that seemed to shake the ground itself, his boots sinking slightly into the gravel as he adjusted the weight of his belt. His belly strained against the buttons of his uniform, the polished badge on his chest gleamed, and his hand rested with quiet menace on the grip of his pistol. He scanned the figures before him, the groaning bikers sprawled in the dirt, the knife glinting where it had fallen, his son Roy on his knees clutching his wrist, and Daniel standing tall beside his wife. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, and for the first time in years, his authority did not seem absolute. The air vibrated with tension, as though the night itself held its breath. Roy scrambled to his feet, pain etched into his features. His bravado cracked, but not entirely gone. "Daddy," he gasped, voice thick with desperation and shame. "He jumped us. He attacked us." The words spilled quickly, half plea, half lie, but heavy with expectation. He believed, as he always had, that his father's power would shield him from consequence, that the weight of the badge could bend truth to his will. The sheriff's gaze hardened on Daniel, his jaw clenched, the muscle twitching beneath his skin, his hand tightening slightly around the grip of his pistol. "You laid hands on my boys, Amana," he said, his voice low and heavy with the authority of a man who believed the town itself was his domain. The words carried not just accusation, but a promise of retribution. For years, his word had been law, his silence had been shield, his family untouchable. Now, for the first time, that order stood on the brink of collapse. Daniel did not flinch. He reached slowly into his jacket and withdrew a small black wallet, flipping it open with calm precision. The light from the cruiser reflected off the identification within, the insignia of service, the proof of his years, the quiet authority earned not from inheritance but from sacrifice. His voice carried evenly, without anger, without tremor. He named what had been done, how his wife had been tied, beaten, mocked, her life threatened by men who called themselves protectors of the town. Each word fell into the silence like stone, stripping away the illusion of control that Sheriff Harper wore like armor. For the first time, doubt flickered across the sheriff's face. It was brief, quickly smothered by pride, but it was there, an unsteady crack in the facade. He tried to mask it with bluster, raising his chin, speaking louder, insisting that in his county his law reigned supreme, that no outsider could dictate what justice looked like. His voice thundered, but beneath it lived the trembling knowledge that the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Daniel's response was quiet, and that quiet was more dangerous than any roar. From his pocket, he drew his phone, tapped the screen, and turned it outward. The glow illuminated the night, revealing not just a recording, but a live feed already pulsing across the vast web of social media. The images were unmistakable. Roy and his men binding Alicia, their laughter ringing out as insults filled the air, the strikes against her face, the cruelty in every gesture. It had all been captured by a hidden camera Daniel had prepared when his instincts warned him earlier that day. Thousands were already watching, comments racing across the screen. Justice for Alicia. The Harper's empire is crumbling. Expose the truth. The sheriff froze, his face draining of color. The power that had defined him, that had shielded his family, was unraveling in real time. He glanced at the raised phones of bystanders who had begun to gather, drawn by the flashing lights and the unfolding spectacle. Cars that had once driven past in silence now lined the road, their occupants no longer willing to look away. Neighbors who had spent years turning their heads stood with phones in hand, recording, their whispers sharp and condemning. That's the sheriff's boys. They tied her up. Monsters. Every last one. The air was thick with judgment, and for the first time, the Harper name once feared, once revered, was spoken with disgust. Roy's face twisted, his arrogance shattered, his eyes darting between his father and the growing crowd. The other bikers moaned in the dirt, their confidence broken, their strength revealed as nothing more than the bullying of cowards. Sheriff Harper's hand hovered near his holster, trembling slightly, his mind racing between pride and self-preservation. He could draw, could cling to the last remnants of power through violence, but the eyes of the world were upon him now, and the world was no longer silent. Slowly, with a breath that rattled through his chest, he lowered his hand. The authority that had lived there for decades slipped from him, leaving only a man stripped of myth. Daniel stepped closer, his shadow falling across the sheriff, his presence towering not through anger, but through truth. His voice was calm, steady, final. He told him that the world had changed, that the silence that once protected men like him had ended. Justice was no longer his to define. The weight of his words was undeniable, not because of volume, but because of the chorus rising from the crowd behind him, the voices of a town no longer willing to hide in fear. Alicia stood now, her wrists raw, her body weary but unbowed. She looked directly at Roy, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. She reminded him of his words, the cruel certainty with which he had declared that she did not belong. And she answered with a truth sharper than any blade. She belonged wherever she stood, and no family of bullies could strip her of her humanity. The crowd murmured, their faces turned toward her, their eyes alive with recognition. In that moment, she was no longer a victim, but a symbol, her defiance burning brighter than her bruises. Deputies arrived minutes later, their cars flooding the road with more lights, their faces drawn with unease as they saw the phones raised, the live feed still streaming, the weight of truth undeniable. For once, they did not look to the sheriff for instruction. They looked to the law as it was meant to be, and they placed cuffs on the wrists of the Harpers and their men. The empire built on fear collapsed with the click of metal restraints, each flash of a camera sealing its fate. Daniel wrapped his arm around Alicia, steadying her as the adrenaline drained from her body. She leaned into him, exhausted but strong, her head resting against his shoulder. Together they walked toward their truck, leaving behind the flashing lights, the broken bikers, the shattered myth of a family that had ruled through intimidation. The crowd parted for them, some whispering, some calling out words of thanks, some simply recording the final image of a woman unbroken and a man who had stood for her. Someone from the crowd asked who Daniel was, their voice curious, almost reverent. Daniel paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces lit by phone screens, over the eyes that searched him for an identity greater than himself. He could have spoken of medals, of tours in deserts and mountains, of battles survived. He could have named ranks and titles, but he looked instead at Alicia, at the strength in her eyes despite the pain, at the truth they had defended together. His answer was soft, almost quiet. He was just a husband, and no man should stand by while his wife was tied to a post. That night the story spread beyond the town, racing across the country, igniting conversations in homes and offices, in schools and churches. The myth of the Iron Eagles was gone, replaced by the truth of their cruelty. The Harpers were no longer symbols of power, but of disgrace. And Alicia, who had been told she did not belong, became a name carried with respect, her strength remembered as the moment's silence was broken. On their porch later, as the cicadas hummed and the night finally grew still, Alicia leaned against Daniel's shoulder, her body sore, her heart steady. She asked him whether he thought they had learned, whether the men who had tied her, the town that had looked away, the people who had pretended not to see, would carry this lesson forward. Daniel breathed slowly, his arm tightening around her, his eyes on the dark horizon. Maybe they had, maybe they hadn't, but the world watching had, and that was how change began. Alicia smiled faintly, the bruises unable to dim the fire in her spirit. "Then we will make sure they do not forget," she whispered, and Daniel kissed her forehead, promising softly that no one would. The night swallowed their words, but the truth lingered like an echo, sharp, undeniable, unforgettable. Strength was never in the ropes that bind, but in the storm unleashed when the powerless stand unbroken. And in that storm, the myth of false heroes crumbled and the first stones of justice were laid. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. Watch our next video for another powerful journey, explore more of our stories, and don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to see it.